You are listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
Welcome to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My unusually well-informed guest today is Autumm Caines. Autumm is an instructional designer in the Hub for Teaching and Learning Resources at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. Today, Autumm and I are discussing ChatGPT, an artificial intelligence language model that provides instant and personalized responses to questions, which has the potential to drastically impact the way students and instructors access and process information. Autumm, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tim, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
It's my pleasure. Before we talk about ChatGPT and how it impacts higher ed, can we talk a little bit about what it is? Can you describe what it is and what its capabilities are?
Yeah, I'll do my best here. My background is not in artificial intelligence. My background is in human intelligence and human learning and human education. But I'm fascinated by this technology and I have been paying a little bit of attention to it. So I will do my best. So large language models are these forms of machine learning, forms of artificial intelligence that are trained using machine learning as well as human learning, or as well as human training. And basically what they're doing is they are these huge data sets. They're these gigantic amounts of language, English language mostly, that they've been trained on to ultimately what they're trying to do is statistically figure out what is the most probable next word that would come in this particular sequence based on this prompt, based in this context, those kind of things. They're not thinking, they're not reasoning, they are not, it feels like they are, it feels like they're thinking, it feels like they're reasoning when you have a conversation with it. But none of that is going on. It's basically a huge amount of data. So with ChatGPT, we know that ChatGPT is trained on all of English Wikipedia, including not all of, but a really big set of Reddit. There's a lot of Reddit in ChatGPT.
Right.
I've heard that it's everything with 3 upvotes or more, which that's a pretty low bar, but at least there's some bar. That's a lot of Reddit, right? Yeah. Huge scrapes of the web, and other things. We honestly don't know everything that's in the training data set. That's one of the ethical problems with this technology. And that's one of the reasons why we see so many problems with it, right? When we think about who contributes to Wikipedia, who contributes to Reddit, right? Those are people with a lot of privilege. Those are people who have internet connectivity, by and large, probably white males, straight, cis, right? Like, and so all of the kind of predisposed worldviews are baked into that training data at the outset. So of course we see some of that kind of stuff happening in the outputs that we get. Now, I'll just end by saying that there's the machine learning that goes and you take this large amount of data, you do this machine learning on it to basically have it understand where words live in different parameters and what statistically would be the next word that would come in any given sequence. But you get something really kind of not so great when you just do that. So the next layer is to have humans go in and ask the thing questions and then give it human feedback and say, no, you wouldn't say this, you would say that, or you would refuse to answer this question, right? Like we could think about some really like toxic kind of questions that could be asked of these things where we wouldn't want it to respond in the affirmative necessarily, right?
Right.
So we do have a layer of human training that goes in to then fine tune and really refine the answers and start getting them to the place where they're really smooth and it sounds really good. And there's a certain level of safety there as well.
And if somebody's made it this far and they've made it to a podcast or a YouTube, they're probably familiar with ChatGPT, but just in case they aren't, it's almost like Google in that it's a very simple screen. You connect to it, you type in a question or an assignment, and it will return often what's uncannily good in terms of an answer. As you've played with it, have you found any uses for it in your own life, either professionally or personally, where you're like, oh, that saved me 5 minutes?
I think it can save you time for sure. I mean, there's tons of uses that are out there that can be time savers. I have I have not actually applied for any jobs, but I thought it was interesting. I hate writing cover letters. Like when I am on the job market,
Right.
I hate it, right? But I was just curious. So I thought about like what is the writing that I hate doing, right? And so that was one of them. And I was like, okay, here's a job ad that has a bunch of this is something I would apply for if I was on the market, right? And here's my resume.
Mm-hmm.
That's the other thing about ChatGPT. It's not just like a little question. Like it's not just like, hey, what do you think about this? You can feed it lots of text. So you can just copy that job ad and say, here's a job ad, right?
Yep.
Here's my resume, copy your resume or your CV and stick your CV and then say, write me a cover letter for that job ad based on my resume. And then now, is it any good? Could it be better? But it's a first draft,
Yeah, absolutely.
right?
Gives you the bullet points. And
Yeah.
what I think what's so what's the reason it's gathered so much attention is it's, if I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the Turing test, this idea that can you have a computer fool you into thinking that it's a human generating the output? Well, wow. I mean, maybe not the most eloquent human, but definitely a human. It structures the sentences and it's very linear in terms of how it organizes things. It's impressive. Um, and this brings us to some of the chilling things about it. In March 2023, on its website, OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, said that ChatGPT exhibits human level performance on several professional and academic exams. And even ones that are quite lofty, like the bar exam, the LSAT. Even I found amusingly for something, a robot is unlikely to taste wine the same way we do, but it's actually passed a test to certify
Sommelier. Yeah.
sommeliers. Um, and this calls into question so much about the value of exams, how we
Mm.
conduct exams in a way that makes sure we're testing people rather than humans. You've reflected a little bit on this on your blog with blog posts. What are your thoughts on how we test humans now, that we have these capable machines?
Yeah, it really does challenge our ideas of assessment, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
really does start to, and I've had problems with exams for a really long time now. I never felt like when I was taking an exam, whether I did well on the exam or whether I did poorly on the exam, that it was truly a reflection of what I had learned, that it was truly a reflection of what I was capable of, that it was truly a reflection of everything that I had gained from whatever learning experience, I had, whether it was like an end of class exam or some type of placement exam, any of those kind of things. Like I never really felt like they were, I suffer from exam anxiety. I've looked at, a lot of the research saying that, exams oftentimes are based in some really problematic, they make some really problematic assumptions about where people come from and just like in the way that questions are framed, those kind of things. So if anything good comes out of this, if we could start thinking about and shifting over to different ways of assessment where we maybe look at what somebody can actually do,
Hmm.
right? If we can think about, even if it's, if it's, so there's like project based stuff where I'm actually building something or I'm actually creating something. But, even if it's something more theoretical, like the fact that, you can talk about something with, somebody who's an expert or close to an expert that you can articulate. expertise in some kind of way, I think that that would be amazing. I am a little afraid though, because I love writing. I'm a writer, and it's not writing as outcome, it's writing as process that I love so much, right? And it's the fact that like I get interested in something and I decide that I'm going to write about it, whether it be a blog post or an academic paper or a magazine article or whatever. I learn throughout that process of writing, right? Like by the time I actually publish that thing, I have learned so much just through the process of writing about it and thinking about it and reading about it and finding other things to cite and all of that kind of stuff, right? So I would say yes. I think when we think about writing as product, there are some real threats there. But as far as writing as process, I mean, ChatGPT can't really come close to that. Yes, like you were talking about using it as a search engine. And I do talk about, I mean, maybe we can get into this a little bit later, but I talk about three different main uses for the technology. The first one being a text generator, where, yeah, you're just saying, like, I need some output, I need a written product. Here's a prompt, here's the thing, and learning the different ways to prompt it to give you the product that you want. The second use is meaning making, where you would use it like a search engine or you'd use it as a chat partner or something like that to try to make meaning of the world. This use case is highly problematic because, again, it's not thinking, it's not reasoning, it's not looking at truth or reality in any kind of way. All it's doing is trying to figure out the next statistically like word that would come in a particular sequence. And so it's wrong. It's wrong a lot of times. And so using it as a meaning making tool is really problematic and has to be done with great care. Everything has to be fact checked. And I don't know if it's much of a time saver then, because
Sure.
now, right, you're going to have to go back and double back and double check everything that it tells you. And then the third use case I talk about is coding, which I think has its own like it's got its own culture for one thing, right? Copying is not such a big deal when we're talking about coding. Everybody copies. Nobody writes code from scratch anymore,
Right.
right? Everybody goes and copies something and then tweaks it. So that's a specific use case that also has generation and meaning making inside of it, but is inside of a culture that's just much different than the human language use cases. Sorry if I meandered too much there.
Oh
Maybe
no, that's
I
terrific. It invites so many more questions. When you talk about culture, I hadn't thought of it in these terms before, but I recall somebody explaining that software is by far the most complicated thing humanity's ever constructed, because if you're making a car, there might be 1,000 of the same bolts. There's going to be two panels the same on left and right. They'll just be mirror images of one another. And yet code, you would never write the same code twice, theoretically. You would call that subroutine. And when you have things like GitHub, you're saying basically, I stand on the shoulders, maybe not of giants, but of other poor slobs writing code just like me, and I don't have to write it again. I can find it, and so the capabilities of what we're producing goes up and up and up based on what's already out there. And so culturally, you can see that probably the people behind OpenAI see Reddit and Wiki the same way, that you should never have to write when Abraham Lincoln was born, blah, 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 blah. You can just grab that as a subroutine and drag it in. And that's kind of what ChatGPT is doing. It's just cobbling together things that are at least coherent to the question you asked.
Yes, but no at the same time. I don't even think it's that sophisticated necessarily. Maybe if there's only one um answer. So I'll give you an example. I did a presentation recently for some faculty. And I was thinking about what's the best way to sort of explain, this thing to people. And I had an aunt actually who had me on her podcast, and she asked me, nobody had asked me this. I thought it was a great question. She's like, how different is this from like the chat bot that I get on websites? Like I go to a website and it's like, bloop, and there's a little chat agent that pops up, right? And I start chatting with it. And I was like, that's a really good comparison. Like, that's what most people know as far as automated virtual assistants, right?
Mhm.
So I did a little bit of Googling and found out that Amtrak has like an award-winning chat virtual assistant. Her name is Julie. And when you go to the Amtrak website, it's one of the options rather than like navigating the website. You can just chat with Julie and Julie will tell you. And so, I was like, well, what if I asked Julie? I live in the Midwest, right? What if I asked Julie? I'm an Arlo Guthrie fan. I'm looking to go from Chicago to New Orleans. Like, what are my options? I'm thinking about a sleeper car, right? And so Julie gives me links to like the Amtrak website. When I go to those, the Amtrak website sounds an awful lot like Julie because Julie's training data is the Amtrak website, right?
Right.
And she tells me the city of New Orleans line is what I'm looking for, right? And that it would take me from Chicago down to New Orleans. And these are my options for the sleeper car. I asked ChatGPT the same thing. And ChatGPT tells me not just this, but also like how I should plan for delays and how train travel and what I should pack and like things like this. But ChatGPT also does call out Amtrak because Amtrak is one of like it's the only passenger rail that you can use in the US, right?
Right.
Interstate. But it also says that I can do the city of New Orleans or I can do the Crescent Line. But the Crescent Line doesn't go from Chicago to New Orleans.
Interesting. Okay.
The
Yeah.
Crescent Line goes from New York to New Orleans.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, they talk
it
about
knows
that
it's
it
in that
hallucinates
same realm.
sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be a disappointing trip, I think, if you bought those tickets.
If you tried to buy those tickets, right? They'd be
Yeah.
like, no, sorry. And we're already seeing like librarians on social media tweeting and talking about students coming in and looking for resources because you can ask ChatGPT to give you references. If
Hmm.
it gives you something, you can say, do you have a reference for this? And the problem is that the person that they cite might be somebody who's an expert in that field. The journal that it cites might be a journal where those kind of things are discussed. But oftentimes the reference itself is completely fabricated,
Hmm.
completely made up. And so we have librarians who are saying students are coming in looking for these resources and we're just running in circles because we know the authors, we know the journals, but we can't find this article because ChatGPT just fabricated it.
Yeah, what is the Mandela effect? Have you heard of this?
Mm.
It's like the computerized version of the Mandela effect. It's saying
Yeah.
this person probably wrote about that, and if there was a journal called this, it would make sense for that, and it starts to treat it like it's truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've mentioned we've sort of gone from the challenges of testing online to talking about the challenges of assignments like essays, uh, uh, and how ChatGPT can actually do a credible job, again with limitations, but it looks and feels like an essay that you get back from ChatGPT and other AI tools. And in December 2022, which is eons ago, I mean, we're recording here in April in 2023. I'm almost embarrassed to admit that I don't know if I heard the term chat GPT until 2023. So that's how fast things are going. But in December, The Atlantic announced that the college essay is dead. I don't know if you've heard this essay that they wrote. Nobody is prepared for how AI will transform academia. Do you think that's hyperbolic? What do we do in a world where, again, it's another situation where we don't know if we're interacting with a student or if we're interacting with the student's machine?
Absolutely. I do think there's some hype there for sure. I mean, anytime you hear something's dead, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's got another 20
Oh,
years
like,
at least. Yeah.
mm. Is it threatened though? Again, is writing as product under threat? Yes, absolutely. And that's why we see there are huge labor implications for people who create content, journalists and creators and like those kind of folks, right? Like there's definitely a threat when we start thinking about writing as product. But I just feel like with writing as process, now we're talking about something different, right? Now we're talking about using writing as a process of learning something. And whether you're using ChatGPT or whether you're using more traditional research methods and your own process of writing, I don't think that is going anywhere. And so if we focus on cheating and we focus on product, we're going to enter into an arms race with students that is really being dictated by the AI companies and the software companies. We're going to kind of be at their mercy, and that's
They're
going
the
to play
arms.
out.
They're the arms dealers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? And that's going to play out as you would probably imagine, and it's probably not going to be pretty. If we focus on writing as process, if we focus on writing as learning, as the process of learning, and we focus on intrinsic motivation of students to follow the learning that they're passionate about, create relationships with those students where we're guiding them, I think that's going to be a lot better. But it will require more trust. It will require us to trust students at a higher level. It will require us to really, think about the relationship between teacher and student, and think about the way we work with learning and what we expect from learning in different and new ways.
I love the way you describe writing as a process of discovery, and I completely agree. The most engaging work I've ever done. I mean, I have a bachelor's degree. I haven't written a thesis or anything, but even the effort of writing a paper of any sort, you wind up delving into a subject much more than it's an emergent process where you're peeling back the layers of the onion and try to explain it in a way that's coherent to yourself and therefore someone else. It's like that notion that when one teaches to learn, when one writes to read, that you and your potential audience are actually learning from what you're producing. But that gets into a couple of themes. One is that it's always been true that a student who is intrinsically interested in the material and is there to actually learn, the potential is there to do so, and the assignments will often invite that. But if the end result is a piece of paper that says you've done it, there's always going to be a certain proportion of people who will just take the paper and run. If we know that's true, I mean, we've always known that's true, but it's even more true now. It really calls into question how we sort of structure the value that comes from an education, that it really is the education itself. I don't know. I'm starting to like it because the business model really is that we're minting people who are capable of things. How can we reframe it so that it's really about an internal process, that it's a growth process for individuals? I know that's a tough question, but
It's a tough question,
I'm sure you've
right?
thought about it a little bit when you think about how you structure courses online.
Mm. Well, and my professional background is really rooted in liberal arts education. So I spent over a decade working in small liberal arts schools. And so a lot of times I think I go back to some of that as well, where I kind of challenge this idea of skills-based education. And I have a skills-based education. I have 2 degrees from a community college and vocational educational experiences, and I love skills-based. education. No shade there whatsoever. But I also feel like there's oftentimes shade thrown on the liberal arts too, right? It's like, that's lofty, like, get your degree in basket weaving. But there's something about educating whole people and creating informed citizens who can understand and question the world around them in like large and like complex ways. So I wonder if some of it is more of a convergence between the skills-based learning and the more lofty kind of liberal arts, educating the whole person, life of the mind kind of approaches, right? Because there's a lot of, I think, harm that is done in the separation of, your elite liberal arts, high-minded folks in our working class, vocational, right? Like, I think the more blending that we can do with that, the better, right? Our high-minded liberal art, they could probably do with some skill stuff. And our skill stuff people, they need to know how to ask those big questions. They need to know how to navigate a complex world and not just be a cog, right? That's kind of got those skills and working away at building their widgets, right? So I wonder if the answer to your question, it's a tough question that you just asked me, but I really do feel like
That's what this show's all about.
that some of it might go back to some of that blending of what we think of education. And I don't think we're ever going to be at a place where we can absolutely 100%, stamp like this person knows XYZ kind of a thing, right? Like, it's always been fuzzy, and we do our best with it. And I think we do a pretty good job with it most of the time. There's some predatory educational institutions that have happened in the past that were, doing some stuff that wasn't so great for their students, and their students were graduating when they were saying they knew things they didn't know. But I think by and large, higher education is, doing a pretty good job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get a little bit excited, and maybe I'm a Pollyanna, but I get excited about the idea of maybe, and of course, this is challenging to the business model of post-secondary education. But if I imagine that there's a fairly large component, especially the earlier you are in your higher ed, to presenting you with facts and structures and things that you can use to reach conclusions, as opposed to trying to find new conclusions, that maybe we can accelerate that process, that maybe one could get the equivalent of a PhD in 4 years. And maybe there's something above and beyond a PhD that can be pursued after that. But and then the other thing is that the vocational could be a little bit shorter too. And maybe they can get into the, like, what, people are eye rolling about lofty or whatever, but it's still a value, this idea of being able to explore the world, with a practiced eye. That's useful for everyone. I don't know. Do you think that there's that one of the ways we can square the circle is try to actually teach more?
Yeah, potentially. I think there's lots of different models out there, right? And I'm all for thinking about different ways to approach curriculum, different ways to design curriculum. I'm also an instructional faculty at College Unbound. I don't know if we talked about that. I just realized that you didn't include that in my intro there.
Apologies.
But no, that's okay. I teach there part-time, so it's and it's fairly new. It's just this past year, so sometimes I forget. It's like, oh wait, I teach too. But College Unbound is it's a college of it's an undergraduate college based out of Providence, Rhode Island, mostly focused on adult degree completion, that has a pretty radically different approach to obtaining an undergraduate degree that's highly student focused, They've been online because of the pandemic. They're starting to go back in person now, but when they do teach in person, they have all classes on 1 or 2 nights a week so that students can just kind of come in. They provide childcare, they provide food. I mean, like, those are huge barriers that make such a big difference, right? Like, they're huge, but at the same time, it's like, it's so simple. It's so easy. Yeah, it's basic stuff, right? So yeah, I think there's lots of creative approaches that we could take to the way that we think about structuring um, the way that somebody obtains an education that could be impacted by all of this.
So what you were saying just then reminds me of, there's a clear thread in your work when I look at your blog about trying to position education as a leveling of the playing field, that everybody gets to participate, that regardless of your background, you can still be, playing in that space. When I play with ChatGPT, one of the things I like about it is I can sort of be relatively incoherent in terms of sentence structure, et cetera. I can just put my thoughts down and I can say, lay this out in a way that makes sense. And it can do that for me in a way that saves me a lot of time. And I would think that would be doubly true if English were my second language. That would be doubly true if my arm was in a sling and I couldn't type very well, or if I'm using voice recognition. So my concern is that when we come up with expectations that students not use these tools, that it impacts that potential. How do you square the circle in terms of allowing it to be a support for people who would otherwise struggle to produce academic work versus people who are trying to use it instead of doing academic work?
Oh my God, such a good question. Such a good question. No, it's something that I struggle with, especially when I think about instructional design. So I'm an instructional designer, but from like a faculty development perspective, just to kind of clear that up. So I don't actually like create content, and often I'm not even designing courses myself, but I'm working with faculty to help them create content, to help them create design. And a big part of that is designing course policies. And so everybody's been talking about very few institutions have institutional policy around this stuff. So it falls on the faculty member, right? To say, like, in my class, the use of ChatGPT XYZ, right? Or the use of large language models is really what you should do because now there's BARD and there's going to be more, right? There's going to be more of these things coming up. So, if you say it's okay for you to use this, like, you just have to cite it, and you have a student who uses it and they are providing you with very polished text, and you're grading them based on, like, not necessarily like the truthfulness or like the complexity of their arguments, but on like how polished their text is, and you have another student who is not using that because they want to challenge themselves, because they want to go through that slogging of, because they want to be better in and of themselves, right? Is that student going to get graded more poorly because they didn't use the chatbot, right? Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that like kind of keeps me up at night, to tell you the truth. Like, yeah, that is it starts getting very, it starts poking at our ideas of fairness. It starts poking at our ideas of right and wrong and what's cheating and what's not cheating. All of that stuff has been sort of thrown up into the air. My best advice is, don't ignore it. Do something, educate yourself, come up with some type of policy, and then talk with your students about it, and trust your students, and engage and be part of the conversation around it, because it's there's a lot of things being challenged right now with all of this.
May I riff with you just because I'm not an
Yeah.
instructor, but I get excited about it. I've been working alongside instructors for a long time. And
Hmm.
one possible solution would be a kind of a would you're never going to level the playing field completely, but you can level it partially by
Right.
saying this this particular essay, you're allowed to use ChatGPT. Knock yourself out.
Right.
We're not going to be grading you according to the structure and the coherence. We're going to be grading you, as you said, to the insights, the
Hmm.
demonstration of a thought process. And then this one, we will also grade according to format and structure and grammar and spelling so that the student can sort of assess where they sit. Is the problem that I'm not making interesting observations, or is the problem that my grammar is bad? And that would allow the student to sort of tease out where they need to focus. It would let the instructor know, okay, this student is actually struggling in this area. We'll send them to the writing center on campus. You know, but there's a way to sort of tease out where the strengths are.
Hmm.
That would be fun.
That would be fun. I guess what I want. So yeah, we're riffing. We're totally riffing
Yeah,
right now,
please.
right? So like as a designer, I guess my first question is, does that require the student to use ChatGPT? So you can use ChatGPT like on this one assignment, but does it require them to use it?
Riffing back, I would say if I were doing it, I would say knock yourself out, but you don't have to.
Right. And so what would be the point of doing two assignments then if I don't want to use it? If I'm somebody's like, I don't want to use that, I don't
Well,
want to
then you're
deal with
probably
it.
pretty confident on the cosmetic part of writing an essay.
Potentially, or maybe I just want to challenge myself. I'm not
Sure.
confident, but I just want, I want to try. I want to make mistakes. I mean, that's how we learn, right? We make mistakes, we get corrections on those mistakes, and then we learn through that process. And maybe I want that process.
Yeah.
Right. And so if this assignment is something that forces a student to use ChatGPT, then I would have a problem with it because in order, and I have a blog post on this, right, is the privacy
Mm-hmm.
implications. In
Yep.
order to use it, they do not offer like an educational partnership or educational licensing or anything like that, right? You have to just sign up with your email account and your phone number, and you're giving them a ton of personal data. They're collecting every prompt that you give it. Who knows what kind of profile that's building on you, but you're also helping them train their product to make it, better for
Mm-hmm.
them, which they're going to make billions and billions of dollars off of. So that's where I would start to kind of maybe have some concerns, but no, I like the idea behind what you're proposing, right? And the idea of uh kind of comparing, like doing something with it and then doing something without it, and kind of comparing where the strengths and the weaknesses are to better target where the learning needs to happen.
So you have blogged about sort of not just necessarily using ChatGPT in the classroom itself, but also interrogating what it is, what it's capable of, what the implications are. Before we get to that, I want to respond to something you said about universities are struggling or colleges are struggling to come up with policies on this. I work at York University, and it recently commented on its own policy for academic honesty to say basically, unless your instructor explicitly allows you to use AI tools for your academic work, it's not allowed. I
Right.
actually like this policy because, there be dragons. We don't necessarily want to have 2 years of students graduating and find out it was all Chat GPT all along. So, so we need to be mindful about this, and we can't expect everybody to be mindful about it at once. So the faculty members who opt in can play with it. And so you have talked about ways to play with Chat GPT, either as a product or as a concept. Can you outline some of the ideas you have for how you can uh, sort of reflect on Chat GPT in the classroom?
Well, I mean, I've seen some really interesting things that maybe mirror some of the stuff that you have proposed. I've seen some folks do like where they do a prompt. They have the students read some piece of literature or some book or some journal article or something like that. And then instead of having them write an essay, they have them write a prompt that they would give to ChatGPT. And then rather than the students running that prompt, the instructor actually runs that prompt. So that's one way of kind of protecting students, I guess, is don't ask students to create accounts. Just use your account, right? Have students write up the prompt, and then they give you the prompt, and then you actually like either copy or paste or type in their prompts, get the result, and then give the student those results, like either email it to them or print it out, that kind of thing, and then have the student critique the output from ChatGPT, right? Yeah, that's I think that's a really interesting one that does take the privacy considerations of students into concern, and still gives the students some experience with these outputs in a way that helps them to think about them critically and approach them in ways that is maybe a little more critical.
So in April 2023, the month we're in now, CNBC wrote that some college professors are adopting ChatGPT as quickly as students. And I actually saw a tweet where somebody, as you pointed out earlier, you can actually follow up questions with ChatGPT. So you can ask a simple question, then you can modify its output by saying, well, actually what I meant was this. And so you're able to take things like, imagine you're the CEO of Google and you're responding to the threat that ChatGPT may pose. Structure this as a business case for discussion in an MBA class. And it output a very coherent set of questions and concerns and parallels to things that are often taught in school. And so it's the mirror image of students using ChatGPT to produce work. Now we have the potential of faculty members using ChatGPT to produce work. What are your concerns? Where do you think the limits should be? How do we control that aspect? We run the risk of just winding up two toys to talk to one another, as opposed to actually having discourse between the faculty member and the student.
Do you remember the Furby?
Vaguely, I don't.
Like this little fuzzy like toy that would like talk. It was kind of like it had like
and it would
a little
react
beak.
to sound, right? So you could have them talking to one another.
Sound, and it would learn. And people would take like one Furby and put it in front of another Furby. And, like,
I'm gonna have to look that up.
Is that like a thing? Is that what we're doing? We have machines creating curriculum for faculty members to present to students who are using machines to respond to that curriculum, right?
Well, I mean, I said earlier that I use ChatGPT a little bit, and I mean, often what will happen is I'll put in an answer like, no, we can't do that because it's policy, and I'll say, can you make that into a flowery email? And it'll generate a 100-word email to say basically no. You can imagine somebody on the other end going, I don't have time to read this 100-word email, putting it in ChatGPT and having it say, well, he basically said no. You know, and so it really calls into question so many of the ways we communicate with one another. It's kind of scary.
It is scary. It is scary. And this is the point where your mind starts to get blown a little bit again, right? And you start wondering about. But I do think we have to be careful of the hype, and we have to be careful about going too far down the robots are coming for our jobs and that the robots are coming for humanity rhetoric. I feel some of it, but I also feel like there are some of the people who are biggest on some of that hype and some of that rhetoric are the people who stand to gain the most.
Sure.
If this technology is the biggest thing ever, right? And so they paint these pictures of it being the biggest thing ever because they have so much to gain from it. So I do also look at it from a skeptical lens, and I like to be careful with it, but it is a fun thought experiment. And I think we do have to be careful with it. It personally, I try to keep my use of it to a minimum. I try to keep my use of it to exploring it, trying to better understand it. I do use it sometimes. I used it to generate some learning outcomes for a class I'm designing because I hate, right? That's another thing I hate writing. I hate writing learning outcomes, right? And they were bad. They were really bad learning outcomes. But you know what? I'm also an instructional designer. So, like, I don't really write learning outcomes. I usually correct people's bad learning outcomes more than anything, right?
So it's
So
just
it was a
your
great
regular day
start.
job.
Yeah, it was a great start,
Yeah.
Students will understand how to, right? Well, what does that mean? But it gave me a start to give me something to edit. And sometimes and honestly, for most of them, I had to throw them out completely, but at least it gave me some ideas of where to get started with some things. But it's fun to play with. It is, at the same time, I want to be careful of playing with it because I don't think it's necessarily a toy. I'm a little bit uh I'm a little bit perturbed that OpenAI just opened it up to the entire world for free, like the way that they did, especially right, they dropped it. So you were talking about how like December of 2022, that's because they dropped it on the last day of November of 2022.
Yeah.
Right at the same time as finals for most of higher education in North America, right? So, I mean,
Not a
just
lot of
kind
time to
of perfect
react.
timing.
No.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of time to react.
Well, that brings me to another sort of thread to pull on because you mentioned that it's free, and Mark Andreessen, who I think was behind Mozilla and Firefox, and he's a
Right,
venture capitalist. He's
right.
often quoted as saying, "If the service is free, you are the product."
Ah, yeah, that's a famous one.
And that picks up on what you're saying, that the reason it's free is because it's worthwhile to get feedback. It's basically not just now munching on data from Wikipedia and other sources available online. It's munching on our questions, on the
Hmm.
prompts that we put in. Other than, potentially copying in sensitive or confidential material from your own employer and going, summarize this for me, and now ChatGPT owns that information suddenly. For more sort of straightforward questions and information we put in, what are you seeing as the downside? What is the impact of us sharing our innermost thoughts with this machine?
Well, I mean, think about the huge market that there is out there right now for personalized advertising. That
Mm-hmm.
most of the time, those data brokers are getting that information from, what you search online and what you're shopping for and the medical questions that you ask Google. Well, now you're asking it of a chatbot that feels really human, right? And who knows all kinds of like personal information. If you read their terms of service, they're very clear that they're collecting your personal data, that they're willing to sell your personal data to third party vendors, right? And so, yeah, I just think about, the amount of information that they ask you at sign up too, right? The fact that they ask you for a phone number or to connect to a Google account, that's a pretty powerful identifier in
Mm-hmm.
terms of tying things back to you personally. And some people are like, oh, big deal, so I get to see ads that I actually care about rather than ads that I don't, right? But that has a lot of power behind it in terms of manipulation of people, understanding what they like and what they don't like, what motivates them, maybe how much they're willing to pay for different products, those kind of things, how much they might be at risk for something like insurance rates, that kind of stuff. And if you
Sure.
just take everything from like the digital redlining, surveillance capitalism, Cambridge Analytica kind of all of that whole like line of thinking, right? And then think about what you could do with all of the data that you're giving ChatGPT. Right now, it's coming from Google searches and internet history and clicks on shopping ads and things like that. But if those same kind of things, those same kind of pictures were painted with the conversations, the sometimes very intimate conversations back and forth, right? It's not just one query where I'm like, give me hair salons near me, right? But I'm actually talking about like maybe the texture of my hair and like the last time I got a cut or the products that I'm using or medical questions that maybe I have about, a spot I've got on my skin or a pain that I'm having or
And all of a
something like
sudden
that. Like,
your life insurance is more expensive and you wonder why. Yeah. Yeah,
I mean,
good
we
point.
already have those. We already have all of that. Like economies are already set up through data brokers and like, data collection processes that are already in place. So the fact that we have a new tool that's collecting data in a different way that is good at sentiment analysis and good at like very succinctly like looking at a bunch of data and saying, here are the points that are important, that's a little scary to
Okay,
me.
I'm gonna have to see if I can find a way to make it forget everything I've typed in so far. So this has been a terrific conversation. Thank you so much, Autumn. I have one last question to sort of cap things off, and in addition to your work online describing ChatGPT and its impact on higher education, I guess I sort of have two questions. One is, are there other people online or other sources of information that we should be looking at about this? And then finally, what do you see as the trends coming that are going to, that flow from AI in higher ed?
Mm. So let's start with other people that you should check out. I'd highly recommend that you take a look at the Distributed AI Research Institute, DAIR, and that's DAIR-institute.org. Some of the folks associated with that I've been paying attention to are Timnit Gebru and Emily Bender, Margaret Mitchell. They wrote a paper about a year and a half, 2 years before ChatGPT hit called The Dangers of Stochastic Parrots, about some of the dangers of large language models. So I would highly recommend that you check them out and check out the work that they're doing. They're doing a lot of work to combat some of the hype around AI. And at the same time, I mean, Bender is a linguist and Gebru is an AI scientist, right? So they want to see AI in the world. They just want to see it in responsible ways. I also talked a little bit about digital redlining, and so I would be remiss if I didn't mention Chris Gilliard. His work on all of that is just super stellar in terms of better understanding the data flows that are happening right now with surveillance capitalism and all of that. And so, like I just say, look at some of that and then think about how it would maybe be applied to the questions that you're feeding ChatGPT, thinking really carefully about that kind of stuff. And then as far as where things are going, I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of the cheating stuff and kind of figuring out how we're going to deal with that. I'm worried about so 3 days ago, Turnitin just dropped their new AI feature. That's part. So if anybody who is a Turnitin customer all of a sudden just had this as a feature where you're now getting a score that tells you what they think the percentage of AI generated content in a particular paper is, that's highly problematic. It's really hard to do that. They also didn't provide any. They say that the tool has a 1% false positive rate, but they didn't provide any proof of that. They just kind of said, take our word for it. We've done studies. We've proven this somehow, but they haven't given us anything to let us know like how they came to that number. A lot of institutions have just kind of been forced into it, and now, I worry about faculty who maybe haven't been paying as much attention to this. They probably heard of it, but I mean, there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of reading and a lot of thinking and a lot of actually, tinkering, those kind of things to really get your head around these tools and how they work. Somebody who hasn't had the time and the effort and the energy to be able to do that, now being presented with this very simple, easy score that just says, right, this paper is whatever percentage AI generated. I think that's something that we got to think about really hard. So I think that's going to be part of it. I also think we need to be careful and keep an eye out for other ed tech vendors. So the ChatGPT API is another big thing that was released recently that we haven't heard as many people talking about, but this is basically an integration into other tools. So we're going to see these large language models built into other types of technology. And so thinking about the features that they are embedded into and that they're provided with, and are they really helpful? Are they predatory? Are they somewhere in between? I think that's another thing that we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to.
That's brilliant, because what that means is that you don't even necessarily know you're playing with ChatGPT, and yet the data that you put in and the corrections that you provide are going exactly to the same place. So yeah. And if that one place gets subpoenaed or sold or whatever, then your information is being used in ways that may not be in your best interest. One of the themes that comes from what you were saying is we can be, and we should always have been, but we can be excited about academic papers because they are getting pressed into service so quickly. Things that they're describing now might sound like science fiction, and yet they will the implications they're describing may come home to roost in 6 months. So there's a real vibrancy to academic papers now that we can see. Even open AI is using academic output to create the technology.
Right.
It's really exciting to see that happen. At least it sort of speaks to the value of higher ed and actual original output. So thank you so much for your time, Autumm. This has been terrific.
This is great, Tim. Thank you so much for having me.
My guest today was Autumm Caines. A link to Autumm's website, autummcaines.com, will be in the show notes. That's Autumm spelled AUTUMM. I'll also make sure it's in the show notes along with some of the links that Autumm described earlier. My name is Tim Hampton, and you can reach me at tim@unusuallywellinformed.com.
Thank you for listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on the Unusually Well-Informed podcast are their own and do not reflect that of their employer or any other affiliation.